light's a little crazy. I'm trying to run from the light a little bit. Hi, I'm Mo. It is April, and that means that it is one more month of zero waste. It is time to check in and have another zero waste challenge that is appropriate for beginners to advanced. So every month here at Mad Cat Quilts, we do a one more month to zero waste challenge, and we become more zero waste in our everyday lives 1 month at a time. We have already done things like a trash audit and a declutter and switched over to using non-disposable bags when we go shopping or when we store food. Today we're going to talk about compost, and we're going to talk about food scraps. So composting is the method of taking all your food scraps and putting them somewhere to essentially rot and become soil. This is a very common practice, especially for gardeners, but luckily now many places, many cities have composting available. And your challenge for this one more month of zero waste is to really think about your food scraps. So I personally garden in my backyard and I have a compost pile. None of our food scraps, except a few, which I'll talk about in a minute, go to landfill. They all go into the compost pile. One of the great things about composting is that it really makes you think about all the food that you're potentially wasting, the leftovers that you don't eat, the onion skins, the outer leaves of lettuce or cabbage. It makes you think about all those things and what could be done with them instead of simply throwing them in the trash. Composting is very simple. It's basically just taking food scraps, putting them in a pile, and letting them decompose. It's important to remember that nothing naturally decomposes the way that it's supposed to in landfills. Landfills, because they're packed so tight and because they have all sorts of chemicals, plastics, and other things in them, create a system and an environment where natural organic matter can't decompose in the natural organic way. And instead of decomposing and just turning back into dirt, most of it decomposes and turns into methane gas or other harmful gases and chemicals. That's the reason you don't want food scraps in the landfill. You don't want food scraps in your traditional trash. There's a couple ways to combat food scraps. The first and easiest is composting. All you need to do is keep all your food scraps, so that's any vegetable matter, onion skins, potato peels, cabbage leaves, anything that you have cooked and then not eaten. So anything that has to do with, leftovers. If you had a salad but didn't finish, throw it in the compost. If you had rice and it went bad, throw it in the compost. Anything that you can think of, with a few exceptions. So the very few exceptions are meat. No kind of meat can go in the compost. So no bones, no skins, no flesh. Dairy is the same way. You shouldn't put any leftover milk or cream or cheese in your compost. If you have a salad and it needs to go in the compost and has a little tiny bit of like dairy dressing on it or a little bit of cheese sprinkled on, that's okay. That's not going to hurt your compost too much. But composting does require that you keep it in sort of a balance, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. So no meat, no dairy is the general rule. I feel like I have some controversial views on composting because besides meat and dairy, I'm basically anything goes. Your coffee grinds, your paper towels, your paper bags, anything that's not printed, anything that's brown can go in the compost. Anything like coffee filters can go in the compost. Your hair and nail clippings can go in the compost. Your orange peels, a lot of people say no citrus, they can go in the compost. Anything hard like nutshells, they can go in the compost. Any of that stuff can go in the compost. There are reasons why people don't agree with that. No animal waste can go in the compost. If you want to compost that, you can compost it in a separate bin, and you can do that. You can even compost human waste, which we don't do. We know why composting is great. Composting is great because it keeps food waste out of the landfills. It provides dirt and soil and creates a nutrient-rich environment to plant plants in. But how do we compost? So we compost by getting a mix of browns and greens. Greens are going to be all your wet food items, like your vegetables, your leftovers that are all smushed together. And browns tend to be dried leaves, or in our case, we can use the coffee filters, paper towels, and things. And the mix together is what creates this nutrient-rich soil. So if you have all greens, it's just going to be a gloppy, soppy mess. And if you have all browns, there's not going to be enough bacteria to break everything down. So you want a good mix. You might be saying, but I don't have a backyard. I can't compost. You can compost even if you don't have a backyard. You can compost even if you don't intend to use the soil, and I highly suggest that you do. There are a lot of options for people who are not planning on using the soil themselves. One option is to donate your compost materials to a gardener. Gardeners will take your compost. They want compost. They want that soil working and those browns and those greens, and they definitely want that nutrient-rich soil that develops. So if you know anyone who has a garden and who composts, you can always arrange a pickup or a drop-off for your compost. Option number 2 is that in a lot of cities there are green spaces or community gardens that compost, and often, a lot of times, there are compost depots or compost stations at farmers markets. So farmers markets will set up a place where you can bring your compost to the farmer's market and drop it off. Now, a lot of cities even compost curbside, which is really exciting. I know that New York was doing kind of a pilot of this, and there are smaller cities that are doing it as well. So along with your regular trash, your recycling, there's also a compost bin that you put your compost materials in, and it is picked up on trash day. So those are all good options, and you can definitely look around in your local area to find that. You could also compost for yourself if you have houseplants, if you have a stoop garden, if you have an herb pot. You can use just a big bucket and put your compost in there, and that way you will be creating soil to use in your houseplants or anything that you have indoors. So even if you're not a gardener, you might still want some of that soil. How do you get compost? How do you keep your food scraps? You can keep your food scraps in a bowl, a compost container, a bucket, anything that is large enough to hold some food scraps. I saved some from the compost to show you. It has some asparagus sticks, it has some onion skins, it has some potato skins, it has some pieces of lettuce that were no good, and probably a few other things in here. We just keep it in the kitchen. We take it out often enough that it doesn't usually smell. The cats don't usually bother it unless there's broccoli in there. You know how Irving loves his broccoli. I think just a big old bucket, like a Home Depot bucket, is a great bucket to keep things in. If you were going to keep that as your compost pile, I would drill a couple of holes in it so that it gets aerated. I would keep it out on your stoop or on your fire escape or on your back porch, and I would just turn it with a trowel every couple of weeks. If you are planning on taking your compost to a facility to drop off or a farmer's market, I would suggest maybe keeping it in the freezer. So there are compost bins that you can keep in the freezer, or you can just keep it in a Ziploc bag and just empty out the Ziploc bag or any kind of container that's big enough for you. So those are all great ways that you can keep your compost and deposit it either in your own compost pile or in a composting facility. Just another quick word on food scraps. A great thing to do besides composting is to not waste so much food in the first place. So of course, eating your leftovers, only making what you need, making sure that you're eating everything, making sure that you're not cooking in excess are all important parts not only of reducing your food scraps, but reducing your food waste. Making sure that you are only making what you need is really important. cutting down on leftovers is really important. Eating everything and meal planning or figuring out a way to reduce your food waste in the first place is probably the most important step. Since I already compost, another step and something that I want to work on in April is making stock and using food scraps for making other food. There's so many options for using food scraps to make other food. For instance, you could make vegan bacon out of banana skins, or you can make stock out of all your vegetable scraps, or you can make jams and jellies or infuse things from the scraps that you have. Those are all great possibilities, and for me personally, one thing that I would really like to learn how to make and learn how to use my food scraps wisely with is by making stock. I had a bad stock experience when I was younger, and I've never quite gotten over it. I won't go into the gory details, but it really put me off making my own stock, and I just think I was inexperienced and I was not knowledgeable enough, but now I am. So this month in April, I hope to save my food scraps and make some veggie stock to save in the freezer and be able to pull out when I want to make a soup or when I need a simple broth. We will do a check-in for April where we check on your compost and we do a little more compost investigation. Your task for now is to research compost in your area and start composting or start using those food scraps to reduce food waste. What are your methods for combating food waste? Leave some comments down below. I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.